banquet hall froze as the king raised his cup. The liquid inside was not ordinary wine. It carried the ashes of those who had dared defy him, cremated, crushed, and mixed into the blood-red drink. Every eye in the hall followed his movements. Every heartbeat pounded with dread. He lifted the chalice, swallowed deeply, and then gave the order. Drink. Servants began passing goblets along the tables. The nobles' faces turned pale, but hesitation meant only one fate: execution before the court. Some gulped it quickly, forcing it down their throats, their lips stained like blood. Others trembled, staring into the dark swirl, knowing they were swallowing the remains of the king's enemies, perhaps even friends. A ritual of loyalty, he called it. A feast of terror, whispered the rest. The ash tasted of smoke, of iron, of death itself. And as silence spread over the room, one thought consumed them all. How far would this king go to bind his court to him forever? The story of this king is not remembered for his triumphs in battle or the grandeur of his palaces. His legacy is whispered for something far darker, a ritual that made loyalty indistinguishable from horror. Defeat on the battlefield was not enough for him. Death by the sword was too merciful. For enemies, he reserved a punishment that did not end with the grave. Their bodies were burned, their bones crushed, their ashes swept into urns. And then came the final cruelty. Those ashes were poured into the king's wine and shared with his court. The first time the goblets were filled, the nobles believed it was theater. A grotesque gesture, perhaps, but nothing more. Yet when they lifted the chalices to their lips, the truth cut deeper than any blade. The taste was unmistakable. Dry grit coating the tongue, the acrid bite of smoke, the faint tang of metal that clung to the throat. It was death itself, liquefied and swallowed. Some forced it down with trembling hands, eyes watering, bile rising. Others gagged, spilling crimson liquid across the table, praying the king would not see. But he saw everything. His gaze followed every hand, every sip, every flicker of hesitation. Every feast became a stage of terror. To sit at the king's table was no honor. It was a sentence. Survival depended not on wit, nor wealth, nor loyalty spoken aloud, but on one's ability to drink without hesitation. The ritual was merciless in its design. A lord who faltered, even for a heartbeat, was dragged into the courtyard and executed before the crowd. The sound of the axe striking flesh was the chorus that followed the feast, a reminder that hesitation was treason. Those who survived carried the ghost of what they had consumed. One account speaks of a young noble who froze when the cup was passed to him. His father had once been a general executed by the king. When he recognized the ashes in the drink, he broke. He could not raise the goblet. The king smiled, nodding to the guards. The youth's last scream was drowned out by the king's toast, his body dragged away before the court. Another tale tells of a woman who, in desperation, smeared the ashes across her lips rather than swallow them. The deception failed. Her body was found hanging from the palace gates at dawn. But there was another story, more chilling still. A duke, older and cunning, tried to trick the ritual. He lifted the goblet and let the wine touch his lips but did not swallow. He thought he could fool the king's gaze. Yet the king had been watching. He ordered the man to open his mouth, and when the truth was revealed, the duke was forced to drink twice the amount. Witnesses say he choked, the ashes caking his throat, and he died convulsing at the table, while the king laughed. To attempt defiance was worse than death. It was humiliation, dragged out for all to see. And the torment did not end when the feasts were over. Those who survived carried the taste of ash with them into their dreams. Nightmares of burning pyres haunted their sleep. Some vomited for days, unable to rid themselves of the phantom taste. A few fell into madness, whispering to themselves about the voices of the dead they had swallowed. The ritual did not only scar the body, it branded the soul. But the true genius of the king's cruelty was not in the punishments. It was in the silence that followed. Each noble who drank became complicit. Their survival was built on desecration. They could never denounce him, for to do so would expose themselves as willing participants in his crime. The ritual bound them tighter than chains. They had swallowed death, and with it, their freedom. The ashes coursed in their blood, a reminder that they were no longer merely courtiers. They were prisoners of their own survival. The terror spread beyond the feasting halls. Servants whispered of the chalices in trembling voices. Soldiers in the barracks spoke of the ritual with dread, wondering if their turn might come. Even the common people heard the rumors. Markets fell silent when the story was mentioned, mothers pulling their children close as if the very words carried a curse. The king's cruelty became a shadow that hung over the entire kingdom, a weapon as effective as any army. No one could imagine defiance when even survival required swallowing ash. Beyond the borders, Foreign emissaries carried tales of the banquet back to their own lands. Some dismissed it as madness, an exaggeration of enemy scribes, but others believed. Diplomats returned pale and shaken, speaking of goblets raised under torchlight, of nobles with lips stained black. Neighboring rulers listened with horror, realizing that here was a monarch who ruled not with honor or law, but with ritualized desecration. He was not just feared, he was cursed. But cruelty has a price, even for kings. The ritual designed to bind loyalty also bred suspicion. Nobles no longer trusted one another, for each had seen the other drink. Friends became rivals. Families broke apart, unable to look each other in the eye after surviving the same degradation. The king believed he had secured absolute obedience, yet in truth he had sown seeds of rot that would one day reach his own throne. What he mistook for loyalty was only silence, a silence waiting to break, and when it did, it would shatter everything. The ritual had transformed the palace into a prison made of goblets and guilt. No sword hung heavier than the chalice passed from hand to hand. The nobles had come to dread the sound of pouring wine more than the clang of drawn steel. Yet the king's cruelty was not satisfied with silence. He sought to deepen the ritual, to weave it into the marrow of his reign. Every feast was staged with meticulous calculation, each cup raised like a weapon disguised as a toast. In time, the ritual no longer shocked the courtiers. What once made them gag now became routine. They drank because they had no choice. Their lips grew numb to the taste, their souls hardened to the act. Yet with every swallow, the poison spread, not through their bodies, but through their loyalties, their friendships, their very sense of humanity. The ashes of the dead had turned them into shadows of themselves, bound together not by trust, but by fear. The king understood this transformation. He had built it carefully. To him, the banquet was not merely a test of loyalty, it was a forge. Each noble who raised the cup was reforged as his creature, a man or woman who had killed their own conscience to survive. He wanted not advisors, not companions, but ghosts who carried the mark of his power within them. His cruelty was not random, it was systematic, a ritualized desecration designed to strip away humanity until only obedience remained. Yet obedience bought in ashes is fragile. Beneath the stillness of the feast, cracks began to appear. The nobles whispered in corridors, their words poisoned by paranoia. Who could be trusted when every face had swallowed the same horror? A man who had shared the cup could not be a friend. He was a mirror reflecting the same guilt, the same silence. The court, once a place of alliances and intrigues, became a hall of strangers, each afraid of the other, each knowing too much of the other's shame. There are records, scribbled notes from servants, half-burned letters smuggled beyond the palace walls, that describe the psychological torment that followed. Men who once boasted of courage wept in solitude, their hands trembling as if still holding the goblet. Women who had laughed at banquets now awoke screaming, clawing at their throats as if ashes still clung there. Some nobles sought priests, begging for absolution, but none could be given. For how can one cleanse the soul of drinking the dead? The ashes were not washed away. They lingered in memory, in dreams, in guilt. The king, of course, saw all this. He watched as his court fractured into shards, and he smiled. To him, their despair was proof of victory. He had not only conquered their loyalty, he had conquered their very identities. No rebellion could rise from men who could no longer even look themselves in the mirror. No alliance could be formed from nobles who feared the reflection in each other's eyes. He had turned his court into walking tombs, each one carrying within them the remnants of his enemies. But there were whispers he could not silence. Among the servants, among the soldiers, among the people outside the palace walls, stories began to spread. They told of the banquet with shuddering voices, of nobles drinking death as though it were wine. Some called it a curse, others called it justice, but all agreed it was not natural. Rumors took shape that the ashes contained not just the remains of the king's enemies, but their spirits, that every swallow bound the drinker not only to the king, but to the dead themselves. One tale claims that during a feast, a noble collapsed in his seat, eyes rolling back, body convulsing. Witnesses swore they heard him screaming in voices not his own. Another speaks of a man who, after drinking, began speaking words he had never known, the language of a distant province, the very home of the enemy whose ashes had been mixed in. Was it madness or possession? The line between superstition and truth blurred, and fear deepened. The ritual had begun as a weapon of control, but now it carried with it the weight of the supernatural. The nobles feared not only the king, but the dead themselves. To drink the chalice was not only to risk execution if one refused, it was to invite the voices of the slain into one's body. The palace became haunted, not by ghosts in corridors, but by ghosts in the veins of every man and woman forced to drink. And yet, despite all this, The ritual continued. The king demanded it, and the court obeyed. Every feast was another nail driven into the coffin of their humanity. Every cup raised was another chain tightened around their souls. The banquet of ashes had become more than cruelty. It had become a theology of fear, a dark religion with the king as its god and his court as unwilling worshippers bound by blood, bone, and fire.
The ritual of ashes had long since stopped being a single act of terror. It had become the skeleton on which the king built his rule. Every banquet was no longer just a gathering. It was an execution chamber in disguise, a theater of loyalty staged again and again until it no longer shocked, until it no longer even needed words. A servant poured, a chalice passed, a noble drank, and the silence afterward was as binding as any oath. Yet the ritual did not simply freeze the court in fear. Over time, it began to reshape the very kingdom. With repetition, the feast grew darker. The king began demanding that the chalices be filled higher, that the nobles drink deeper. He mocked those who hesitated, daring them to show weakness. It was not enough to sip. He wanted gulps. He wanted ashes dripping from the lips of his courtiers, stains that marked them as his own. The spectacle fed him. Each swallow was a victory, each trembling hand a hymn to his power. Some nobles collapsed under the weight of it, their bodies rejecting the mixture. Their screams were drowned by the laughter of those who drank more quickly to survive. What began as a ritual of loyalty became a ritual of desecration. The king expanded it beyond enemies. When common criminals were executed, their ashes too were burned and stirred into wine. When neighboring tribes were defeated, their leaders were consumed not by flame alone, but by the gullets of the court. The scope widened until it was no longer only traitors and rebels whose remains were desecrated, but anyone the king wished to erase. He had found a way to turn death into spectacle, execution into sacrament. Nobles who once plotted marriages and alliances now plotted only survival. They sat in silence, staring at one another across the table, wondering who among them would be next to fall. Families fractured, brothers refusing to dine together, fathers refusing to look at their sons. All bonds dissolved under the shadow of the chalice. Even love was corrupted. Husbands and wives drank beside one another, yet afterward avoided each other's eyes, knowing both had swallowed the same unholy mixture. Affection had no place in a court bound by fear. Rumors grew darker with each passing year. Servants swore that the ashes moved of their own accord when poured, swirling faster than wine should allow. Soldiers whispered that they saw shadows slip across the walls during feasts, shadows that did not belong to the living. Nobles claimed to hear voices when they drank, whispers rising from the cup, words half-formed, names half-spoken. One man cut his own tongue out, convinced that the voices had rooted there, that the dead were speaking through him. Another clawed at his chest until he bled, swearing he felt the ashes still burning inside. The king, far from denying these rumors, encouraged them. He called the ritual divine. He declared that to drink was not only to prove loyalty, but to share in his power. He preached that the spirits of the conquered flowed into the veins of those who consumed them, making the court stronger, more eternal. Some began to believe him. Fear had twisted into faith. A dark theology emerged, where the chalice was sacrament, the ashes communion. The king became not a ruler, but a prophet of desecration. His feasts lit like sacred rituals. But faith bred fanaticism, and fanaticism bred madness. Nobles who once trembled now fought for the right to drink first, hoping to show devotion before hesitation could betray them. Some began to boast of their endurance, of how much ash they could swallow without gagging. Others descended into hallucinations, swearing they were possessed by the spirits of warriors whose ashes they had consumed. A few even claimed visions, prophecies whispered from beyond the grave, guiding their choices in council. What had begun as terror had grown into obsession. Yet, beneath this grotesque devotion lay the same unshakable truth. Loyalty born of terror cannot last. Whispers of rebellion, faint though they were, began to stir. Nobles spoke in coded words, never aloud, but in gestures, in looks, in silences too long held. They were not united, for unity was impossible in a court bound by guilt. But desperation began to flicker. A man can drink ashes for survival, but he cannot drink them forever. The poison was not in the cup. It was in the memory, and memory has a way of rising, no matter how deeply it is buried. The longer the ritual endured, the heavier its weight became. What had begun as a weapon of terror was now a burden no soul could carry without fracture. The nobles had grown pale, thin, and hollow-eyed. Their laughter was gone, their voices muted. They moved through the palace like shades, haunted not only by the king's wrath, but by the memories of every cup they had raised in trembling hands. Loyalty had become survival, and survival had become torment. It was in this silence that cracks appeared. At first they were small, a noble excusing himself early from a feast, another suddenly ill when the chalices were passed. Some began to feign sickness, retreating to chambers rather than face the goblet. Servants smuggled scraps of food to their masters, who had gone days without eating, their stomachs rejecting the thought of more ash. In private, nobles confessed their dread to one another, though always in whispers and always with a glance over their shoulder. But fear is like fire. Smother it too long, and it erupts. A quiet rebellion began to take form, not with swords, not with banners, but with silence. A countess left her cup untouched, and though the king's guards dragged her away screaming, others saw her defiance and remembered it. A general whispered to his men that death by the sword would be cleaner than death by the chalice. A servant risked execution by refusing to carry the goblets down the table. Each act was small, almost invisible, yet together they marked the first signs that the ritual's chains were weakening. The toll was visible in the faces of those who still obeyed. Nobles sat at the feasts but trembled as though awaiting execution. Some wept openly, no longer able to hide the collapse of their spirits. A few chose suicide, hanging themselves in their chambers or leaping from the palace walls, preferring death on their own terms to another night of swallowing ashes. Their bodies were found with blackened lips, the ghost of the chalice marking them even in death. The king noticed. He saw the unease, the subtle refusals, the suicides. But instead of abandoning his ritual, he tightened it further. He demanded the feast more frequently. He had the ashes mixed thicker, darker, so that every sip scraped the throat with its bitterness. His rage fed the cycle. The more his court resisted, the more he sought to crush them with spectacle. He mistook defiance for weakness, rebellion for hesitation. In his arrogance, he believed the ritual could never break him. It could only break them. But outside the palace, the story was changing. Soldiers in the barracks whispered of their lords wasting away. Priests muttered that the king had offended not only men, but the gods themselves. Commoners, hearing rumors of nobles forced to drink their enemies, began to call the ruler cursed. Fear still bound the kingdom, but it was no longer the clean fear of obedience. It was the festering fear of collapse. The people waited, hungry, restless, watching for the moment when silence would crack into thunder. The banquet had begun as the king's triumph. Now it was becoming his weakness. Every chalice lifted at his command was another reminder of the torment he had inflicted, another stone added to the weight of resentment pressing against his throne. The court had bent to him for years, but bending cannot last forever. Wood under pressure eventually splinters, and when it splinters, it breaks. The breaking point was coming. The only question was whether the king would hear it before it was too late. The breaking point arrived not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet passing of another goblet. The king had summoned his court for yet another feast, determined to prove that fear still held them in its grip. Servants entered with silver trays, each chalice darker than before, the ashes thicker, the stench unmistakable. The hall was filled with silence so deep it pressed against the ears. Everyone knew what was coming, but something had changed. The nobles sat rigid in their seats, no longer eager to hide their dread. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their spirits starved of hope. They no longer feared only the king. They feared what they had become. Some had lost their voices, unable to speak after years of swallowing ash. Others shook uncontrollably, their bodies failing before their courage. The ritual had broken them, but in breaking them, it had created a new strength. Nothing more could be taken from them. The chalice reached the hands of a baron whose family had been destroyed by the king's cruelty. He stared into the black liquid and did not lift it. The king watched, smiling at first, certain that fear would force compliance. But the baron did not move. When the guard stepped forward, he spoke, not to the king, but to the court. Enough. A single word, frail yet thunderous in its defiance. Others followed. One by one, goblets were set down, hands trembling but unyielding. Some cried as they refused. Others sat in grim silence. The king shouted, his fury echoing through the hall. He demanded obedience, demanded loyalty, demanded blood. But the air had shifted. Where once the courtiers had looked to him in terror, now they looked at each other. They saw in one another the same exhaustion, the same torment, the same longing for release. The chalice that had bound them in guilt now bound them in rebellion. The guards hesitated. For years they had carried out the king's orders without question, but they too had heard the whispers, seen the suicides, felt the weight of curses whispered in markets and temples. To strike now would be to ignite the very fire the king wished to extinguish. And so they waited, caught between command and conscience. The king, sensing the fracture, tried to reclaim control. The tale of the king who made his court drink the ashes of the dead does not end with the silence of his hall. His reign collapsed. as all reigns built on fear must. The nobles broke their chains of guilt. The guards faltered, and the people whispered of curses too heavy to bear. The ritual that had begun as his triumph ended as his downfall. The chalice that once demanded obedience became the vessel of his ruin. Yet history has a way of burying cruelty beneath layers of dust. Chronicles are burned, records are lost, names are softened until they sound like legend. But the story survives, carried not in ink alone, but in the memory of fear itself. Because every kingdom, every empire, every age has its own chalices, rituals that demand submission, acts that turn loyalty into guilt. They may not hold ashes, they may not drip with blood, but they bind just as tightly. The question that lingers is not whether this king was uniquely cruel, but whether he was simply honest about the truth rulers have always known, that to control men, you must first corrupt them, to make them complicit, to force them to swallow something they cannot spit back out. Once their hands are stained, once their souls are marked, they cannot turn against the hand that dirtied them. The banquet of ashes was monstrous, yes, but was it also a mirror? Think of the rituals that bind societies today. Oaths whispered in rooms where refusal means exile, promises signed in ink that cannot be erased, systems where to participate is to compromise, and to refuse is to vanish. We look back at a king who fed his court human remains and call him mad, but perhaps the madness was not in the act itself. It was in the clarity with which it revealed how power truly works. The nobles drank because they had to. They despised it, feared it, loathed it, but in the end, they lifted the cup. How different are we when faced with choices that bind us against our will? When the cup is passed in our own time, do we not raise it too, whispering that survival excuses everything? The king is gone. His throne is dust. His name lingers only in fragments, a curse carried on the breath of storytellers. But the chalice remains, not the silver vessel he raised, not the ashes it carried, but the idea behind it, the unholy bargain of obedience bought with corruption. That is what survives, long after his palace fell silent. And so, the question lingers, pressing against the mind like the taste of ash that never fades. When your chalice is set before you, will you drink, or will you let the silence of refusal be the last word you ever speak?